What's the picture that comes into your mind when you hear the words human rights and refugees? Maybe it's a boat at sea full of people. Maybe it's a sea of faces looking out at you from prison bars. For me, I see a woman standing in front of a barbed wire fence. And I want to tell you her story because that story changed completely how I see my role as a human rights communicator. Her name is Sarah. And Sarah belongs to a group of people persecuted because of who she was. And one day, the secret police came to take Sarah and her husband away. But they escaped out the back door and running through a network of alleys behind their house. They got away and they hired a trafficker to take them across the mountains to a border. And the trafficker took them through the mountains and pointed up to the crest of a hill and said, the border's just beyond that hill. And so when he left them there and they walked on, and when they came to the border, there was that barbed wire fence. Sarah's husband said, we have to go back. There's nothing we can do. But Sarah was pregnant and she wasn't ready to go back to this fate of certain death that awaited her. So Sarah climbed over that barbed wire fence. And when she got to the other side, the police in that other country who had been sending any refugees back, when they found this woman who was pregnant with blood all over her arms, they couldn't turn her back. And so they took Sarah and her husband to the police station. And in the police station, they were asked to fill out asylum papers. And on the line where it says, what's the reason you're claiming asylum? Sarah wrote, because I'm Jewish. Because the year wasn't 2021 or 2016, it was 1942, and Sarah, my grandmother, had just crossed from France into Switzerland. Now the reason I'm telling you that painful story is that for the longest time, that pain and that suffering was what defined me. But that story has also allowed me to find hope, and not only that, but to spread hope for a living. And I want to tell you how that's happened. So, I worked in the communications team of human rights organization Amnesty International. My mission in life was to make people care about the suffering in the world. And my approach was very much built on guilt and fear. I wanted people to know about people suffering. Imagine if this was happening to you. And look at the crisis in the world. One day our freedom could be at stake if we forget the lessons of the past. But I had to admit, looking around, that the world seemed to be forgetting the lessons of history. With despair, I had to accept that being aware didn't seem to make people care anymore. That story I just told you could be happening right now. It is happening right now all over the world. And so I got a promotion. I was made head of brand at Amnesty International, and I made it my mission then to find out what is it that makes people care about human rights. And I started, the facts weren't working, and so I started trying to learn about how we feel, how our emotions drive our politics. And I tried to learn from neuroscience and psychology. And what I found there completely changed my perspective. You see, all of us have this instinctive survival instinct that comes from when we were cave people. You can think of it as a downstairs brain that activates a fear response when we sense threats. So, saber-toothed tiger, or getting in a fight with someone, an angry email from your boss. That part of our brain releases stress hormones. It increases our heart rate, like mine is now. Shuts down rational thought. And this is the key thing, because when we feel empathy and compassion for other human beings, a different part, an upstairs part of our brain, is what brain scanning shows firing up. There's a philosopher who puts this beautifully called Martha Nussbaum. She says, hope reaches out, fear shrinks back. So that upstairs part of our brain fires up when we're feeling safe and comfortable, in control, even through humor and laughter. But how am I, as a human rights communicator, meant to make people laugh when I'm talking about the greatest suffering in the world? So my communication, telling people about a world in crisis and the suffering in the world, was making the people I was speaking to shrink back from refugees instead of reaching out. I was literally activating the wrong part of their brain. So I had to take a step back and look at how I was communicating and how I was working. What the science was telling me was, if I want people to care, if I want people to act, if I want people to change their mind, they need to feel hope. So to begin with, I just wrote a blog post saying that maybe we in human rights need to base our communication on hope, not fear. I didn't think much would come of it. But then I had some colleagues say, well, tell us more. How can we actually do this? And crucially, what they were asking is, well, how are we meant to talk about hope when the countries we're working in are in such a dark state? And that's when I thought of Sarah, that darkest moment of history, of 1942, facing that barbed wire fence. And I realized suddenly, the time when you need hope is the darkest times. And similarly, human rights can't be about showing people what's wrong. They see that on the news. What people need from human rights is to know how we can make things better. And so I started developing a process that I call hope-based communications. And it started life as just a simple checklist that I wanted my colleagues at Amnesty International to stick on their computer screen so they could find a hope in their story, to shift from not just talking about the problem, but also the solution, from threat to opportunity, from fear to hope. I was not a hopeful person myself. I was not one to see the world in a hopeful way, but I was doing it consciously because the world needs it. And I was inspired by the person I consider to be the best communicator in the world. Her name is Anat Shankar-Osorio. And she's a cognitive linguist, so she studies the subconscious impact of the words we use on people we're talking to. And she points out, if we spend all our time attacking hateful politicians who are saying things that appall us, we're repeating their ideas and not our own. So a basic shift that comes from Anat is, we have to talk about what we're for, not what we're against. It's so easy to get caught up in telling people all about the problem that we actually forget to make the case for the solution. When we talk about the world in crisis, that starts to become feel inevitable to us, and that creates despair. When we talk about the world the way we want it to be, we start to build that new reality. And what we need to do is give people an opportunity to be part of making that solution come about. So I work with a cognitive scientist called Laura Liguri, and what she told me is, we are all social animals. We take our cues from the people around us. So if we see people acting a certain way, good or bad, our brain is subconsciously telling us, oh, we should do that too, even if we actually don't think it's the right way to behave. So if we see a lot of people on the news who are against refugees, we might actually hold back in our position, even if it's not what we think. But what this means is, we actually have a lot of power ourselves to shape the world with the way we choose to act and with the stories of other people's behavior that we choose to share. So if you look at the social media feed of a human rights organization, you'll probably see a lot of inhumanity. But we don't often show people how they can do human rights, how they can act with humanity. So let's try and change the picture that we see when we think of refugees. Let's picture instead a big table with hosts and newcomers passing food to each other. That's the kind of picture that was starting to come up in workshops I'd started doing with activists to help them find hope. I was asking them things like, well, how will society actually look different when we have more human rights? What's the opposite of the things we're against? And what does it actually look like when people are doing it? And I was getting back from these exercises a stream of images that hadn't really featured before in my communication. Thriving communities filling parks and streets, diverse communities, people planting trees, men walking their children to school, women walking the streets at night without fear of harassment. And what I realized was we need more pictures, more visions like this in our politics. And that's when I decided to leave Amnesty International and do hope-based communications full time. I want to build a community of hope-based communicators who can help activists find those images. And what drives me, what really inspired me to do this is the reaction I see from activists themselves when they find those pictures are actually already inside them. Just yesterday, I was talking to a group of activists in the Philippines. I did a workshop with them 2 years ago, and they've now set up their own initiative called the Hope Project. And one of them said it was like a light bulb went on. But above all, what really gets me is in a workshop when someone's really skeptical, and like there was a person called May in the Philippines, and it's a really hard time to be an activist in the Philippines. And she was asking really tough questions, and I thought, okay, this isn't a person who's she's not on board with this, that's fine. But she ended up becoming one of the biggest supporters. And she said something amazing. She said it was like she was slowly moving out of her anger-based self into her hope and love-based self. And what I learned from May is that we all need help to share our hopes in public and be vulnerable doing it. Here's what I mean. For example, if I'm against hate and cruelty, that means I'm for love and kindness. Now, I can tell you, it's not easy to stand up in the world of law and politics and talk about love and kindness. But if we never say those things, they have no chance of actually happening. So we need to take a chance and reach out to other people with our hope. Look at me, I just wrote a blog. I thought nothing would come of it. It completely changed my life. I was now the hope guy going around giving workshops about hope and talks. But I have to make a confession. I didn't feel hopeful in here. I hadn't yet applied hope-based communications to Sarah's story, to my story. And then that's when I had to realize she wasn't a victim, but a hero. I thought of the courage and perseverance that Sarah showed to save her family, and it was like a weight lifting off my shoulders. I thought, there's hope in that story too. Sarah lived to be 102. And so I'm going to leave you with a new image, which is Sarah with her husband and her 2 daughters, one of them my mother Ava, outside their little shop in France after the war, building a new life. And I really believe that if I can find hope in my story, we can all be hope-based communicators. It's not about finding a hopeful story. It's about finding the hope in every story. Thank you.